Hello, and welcome to the official Oscarina category breakdown. In this episode, I'm going to be taking a deep dive into all 15 of our categories for the awards. I'm going to be reading their criteria descriptions, give some examples, and drop in a few behind the scenes thoughts in the process. There are a few things I want to go over before we get started. The first is that I wanted these categories to be as universally applicable as possible. Many award shows change their categories around several times in their history, and I've put a lot of thought and effort into preventing that from happening here, because I like the idea that you can compare games from different years to see how they measure up to one another. But that math goes out the window if the number of eligible categories changes at any point. It was also important for the list to be conscientious of modern and retro games alike. So, for each category, I will be providing examples, and my choice of examples really comes down to games that I've played, games that I felt would make for incredibly easy arguments, something that I could mention for the category, and everyone would be immediately able to identify how that game fits said criteria. And then the last tier I used was stuff that would be easy to gather footage for, so I tried to get as much variety as I could, but I'm not going to have footage for every game I mention. I'm pretty much just going to stick with the good examples that I have. And speaking of good examples, I'm also going to be providing some poor examples. And I want to stress that these examples are not necessarily indicative of what will happen, positive or negative. It's entirely possible that I change my mind based on what competes in a given year, or I'm simply outvoted by the community. But nevertheless, I did my best to find games that I felt made for intuitive understanding for us to come to grips with what each category is looking for. And speaking of looking for things, I also wanted to mention that as voters, you are trying to accomplish a couple of things, including showing off games that you enjoy, but also games you think are artistically significant, and finally, games you think others ought to experience now and in the future. I've already broken down the mission statement, which further delves deeper into what this all looks like. We have a lot to cover though, so let's jump in. Like I said before, we have a total of 15 categories, though in effect it is only 14, and I'll explain why in a moment. Categories are fragmented into 5 groups, including the Elite Group, Conceptual, Visual, Auditory, and Theatrical. For the Elite Group, we have one category called Best Pixel. Now technically, there will always be 2 Best Pixel winners, since Best Pixel only looks for games nominated from a given year. So for our first season, it will be Best Pixel 1990 and Best Pixel 1991. For the Conceptual Group, we have Best Direction, Best Gameplay, Challenge and Achievement, Best Gameplay, Discovery and Expression, and Best Level Design. Then for our Visual Group, we have Best Art Direction, Best Interface, and Best Visual Immersion. For our Auditory Group, we have Best Musical Score, Best Musical Track, and Best Sound Atmosphere. And finally, for our Theatrical Group, we have Best Female Character, Best Male Character, and Best Narrative Composition. So now that we have the full list laid out, I'm going to go through each one individually, read its description, and talk a little bit about how some games do or do not reflect the category. So the first is our Elite Group, and we have, like I said, one category, and that is Best Pixel. And I'm probably going to take a little extra time talking about this one because it is our highest honor, and it's going to warrant a more thorough explanation. Because in some sense, if you're able to do well in a multitude of categories, then it becomes the kind of core of your argument for why you should be in for Best Pixel. So, Best Pixel reads as so. Awarded to titles that examine, explore, or contribute in some way to the larger conversation of the human experience, particularly to the growth or innovation of game design, or in capturing or representing a facet of gaming history or culture. Best Pixels are either well-rounded and cohesive in their overall aesthetic or artistic design, or offer an ambitious foray into the world of gaming. They may be aided by overall Oscarina standing, i.e. the more nominations and wins it receives, the stronger its case for this category. Best Pixels are often enjoyable in their time in the present, and we consider having a positive trajectory for the future. So I have about 6 examples that I thought would make for a good argument for Best Pixel, and so I'll read through the whole list and then I'll kind of explain my thinking behind each one. So the list includes Super Metroid, Zelda Ocarina of Time, Soul Calibur 2, Mass Effect, Bloodborne, and What Remains of Edith Finch. And so some of those examples are fairly obvious, I think. Metroid, Zelda, Bloodborne, and even Mass Effect to some extent. They're all highly regarded games, in some cases outright classics. So it's important to note that we're not going to be playing contrarians just for the sake of being a contrarian here. If we agree with the consensus on a game, then we agree. But mostly, critical consensus is important for getting games on our radar. We're not obligated to agree with it. So if a game is truly memorable and artistic, then it should speak for itself. And that's what we'll be looking for. Now, importantly, games such as Mass Effect and Bloodborne are interesting in that, even though they have high critical reviews, they both failed to garner much reception in terms of actual award shows. So we might be choosing games such as those because upon reappraisal, or just because the culture at the time missed them, it doesn't mean that we have to. And so there's a bit of justice in making sure these games, if they are truly classics, that they get the recognition that's deserved. But there's something else, and that is we want to be sure that over time, the Best Pixel winners should reflect games of various genres and appeal. Soul Calibur 2 is a fighting game, and What Remains of Edith Finch is a walking simulator, both of which are probably going to lack in certain categories. Fighting games don't usually have much in the way of story, and walking sims typically lack engaging gameplay. But these are two games that I really love, and they helped open my eyes to the things that could be done in those genres. So even if we love, let's say, RPGs, for example, it's good to branch out from our comfort zones and choose a game that stretches our understanding of what can be done with the medium. It's also good because eventually, when someone goes through to play our Best Pixel winners from start to finish, it would be good if that list surprises them with all sorts of interesting and varied titles. In short, even if a game isn't perfect, it might offer an experience that's special, or it adds dynamic variety in conversation with other Best Pixel winners, or perpetuates thoughtful conversations about the human condition. And if it can do something along those lines, then I'd say it has a very strong case for Best Pixel. So I know not all of those are perfect examples, but like I said, they were examples that appealed to me, and that kind of helped change my perspective. So it's the kind of thing where as long as everybody in the Academy is doing similarly or looking for the games that really struck them as something compelling, even if it was outside of a genre or a style that they typically enjoy, it's a good thing to factor that into your voting process. So now let's talk about some poor examples. The first on my list is Untitled Goose Game. Now I know a lot of people really like this game, it won many awards, but this was a big miss for me. The game lets you play out the fantasy of being an obnoxious goose for a few hours, and I really failed to see the big picture in that. Even if the deep meaning was simply to turn your brain off and relax, I'd much rather have played any of its competitors, which included Slay the Spire, Control, Sekiro, Resident Evil 2 Remake, and The Outer Wilds. So you tell me with a straight face what game you think is more deserving. Now I appreciate that it's different, and who knows, maybe the Academy will overrule me here, and if so, I'm happy to hear that perspective. But as it stands, the game is, well, let's just say it's not exactly Oscarina bait. It was just very simplistic, a bit shallow. It just didn't really have anything that struck me as particularly of note. And the next on my list is Destiny. Now, Destiny is also a fairly liked game, but the main knock it has against it is that there's virtually no story nor any compelling narrative underpinnings to speak of. The single-player campaign is just a tool to get you to level 20 to experience the actual game, which makes it a waste. At least something like Overwatch knows that it's a multiplayer-centric experience, and that's also a game that's probably not likely to make an appearance. You could also extend this to many MMOs in general. And the problem I'm getting at here is that with internet and multiplayer-focused games, is that if they don't have a backbone of a single-player offering, that can make them very difficult to quantify because there isn't a basic measurement for what a general player is likely to experience. Also too, external characterization will not factor into the voting, whether it's the Destiny Codex or Grimoire or whatever that is, or the Overwatch character shorts. It's sort of like factoring in fan art, memes, or YouTube comments about said game when really the focus needs to be on the game in a vacuum. Among Us has a similar problem, except it has even less characterization. It's a retread of Mafia, which is very fun, but it's also not unique to video games. It also doesn't have a story or really any significant messages to speak of. And the other knock here is that it, at least originally, was locked into being an app game. And remember that at present, the vast majority of the footage you see here at the Oscarinas is captured by me. At some point, I can hopefully gain more support when the scale of games across various platforms becomes too much for one person. But what I'm trying to say is I'm not going to be able to hunt down every game ever made, and an app-focused game is not the kind of thing I'll be going out of my way for. I definitely want to include as many platforms as I can, and like I said, if you have a compelling argument, go for it. But it's also the kind of thing where there's not going to be a whole lot to say about this, and I think when you're trying to nominate it, if you sit down to sort of compose your arguments, if you come up to about a page and then have nothing left to say, it's going to be a very clear sign that there just really isn't that much to talk about, and it's not going to make for a strong showcase, it's not going to make for a compelling argument, and it's just not going to interest us. It's not going to interest the Academy, and by that I mean the kinds of experiences the Oscarina is looking for. I also have a game on this list that I think is a poor example, even though I quite like it, and that's Rogue Warrior. Funnily enough, you probably could make a case for this on the grounds that it's funny, but the game's a glitchy mess, and the writing, while hysterical, could only really be nominated for all the things it does poorly. It could work, but I'd wager to guess it'd probably be on my shoulders to vote in such an uncanny pick, and I'd like to think that I'm not that much of a troll. So I'd like to mention that you probably shouldn't expect to see many Call of Duties or Madden NFLs or other simulation games like Pilot Wings. These games can cause burnout very quickly due to excessive releases and a massive emphasis on profit that the quote-unquote art elements of the game can take a huge hit. Simulators also have a tendency to feel like tech demos more than anything. Put another way, it would sort of be like nominating a documentary for Best Picture at the Oscars, or nominating a self-help book at the Hugo Awards. And I understand that games have probably the most vast portfolio, but like I mentioned in the mission statement, every group has their criteria, so while we want to be sure we have an open-minded approach to our choices, that also has to be taken within reason. And I'd like to stress that the games we nominate don't always have to have some deep artistic meaning. Something that is pure fun, say Super Smash Bros. For example, I could see an argument for that because it's escapism in its rawest form. And while it doesn't have a story, there is a takeaway. And for many of them, there is single-player content to enjoy, even if all it does is provide a space for the player to hone their skills or vent some frustration. It still has something to offer without the need of an internet connection, other players, and is something I can record footage of with relative ease. So there's a bit of a case that I could see being made that way. So I recognize that some of this might sound a bit contradictory. How can I say that it's important to look for variety and then have examples of games that somehow don't fit with this supposedly open-ended description? And the reason for this is that each game should gently push the boundaries of what is possible. We are thus not really looking for games that are different, but rather the myriad of ways a powerful emotional experience can be attained. If we can find catharsis in a genre we typically don't pay attention to, then it's especially important for us to pay attention to it then. At the same time, this path needs to be tread thoughtfully and carefully. You can argue for the merits of just about anything, but not everything will offer the same degree of merit in return. At the end of the day, I don't know what games exactly the Academy will be interested in. Every season will bring with it new challenges, in particular challenges to the very Academy itself. And this is why it's an ongoing discussion with no real answer. It's the kind of thing where you check in from time to time and reflect on how you're doing. So again, just remember, these are general examples, nothing concrete, but hopefully it's given you at least some formulated image of the kind of experience that might fit really well here. So let's move on to our conceptual group of categories, starting with Best Direction. Awards excellence in utilizing gameplay mechanisms to convey narrative or aesthetic resonance. The interpretation of the experience, use of aesthetic techniques, and perspective to elicit meaning, and the tone and progression of contextual events are all factors. Direction looks for games that utilize all elements of the experience, especially gameplay, to elicit emotional meaning and narrative implications. And so essentially what this is talking about is the culmination of all the different aesthetic components that build the game, specifically the ways in which gameplay and its supporting components support the meaning, the story, or the kind of purpose or intentions behind the piece. And for my main example for this, I'm going to go with Super Metroid. So in addition to all of the aesthetics of the other categories working in tandem with one another, Super Metroid tells a surprisingly powerful narrative through gameplay. It's similar to points I'll be bringing up for Castlevania 4 this year in that they are experiences in which you gain meaning from the game simply through the act of play. While there are cutscenes in Super Metroid, they are extremely minimal, and many of them are well hidden such that you may not even notice them. Another way to think about this is environmental storytelling. It's you are playing through the experience, you see the world through the lens of your character, and rather than ham-fist the narrative with lots of text, it's very subtle, and you have to just interpret your feelings, thoughts, and ideas based on the information that gets presented to you. Some other good examples of this include Zelda Majora's Mask and BioShock Infinite. Majora's Mask has a very complex narrative in an intricate way in which you manipulate time to develop the story, and BioShock Infinite has a very poignant message that is highly reliant on the gameplay and overall presentation being conveyed in a very particular way. I'm not going to get into too much of that because I know BioShock Infinite is a kind of contentious title for a lot of people. So in some sense, this category is very interested in games as art. It's looking for all the different ways something meaningful and purposeful is conveyed through its components. Some poor examples of this, I would say, are Slay the Spire and Destiny. Slay the Spire, while fun, really has no narrative to speak of, and all its art and aesthetic choices have a childlike aesthetic that doesn't really contribute to the premise in any meaningful way. To get a sense for what I'm talking about, something like Mario World 2 Yoshi's Island has a cutesy art direction, except in that game, you're tasked with escorting a baby, so you could argue that you're seeing the world through the eyes of a child. And that's not something you could really argue with Slay the Spire. While anything can theoretically be argued, some perspectives will simply have more credibility than others. As for Destiny, it has an extremely fragmented narrative. Most of its world building is separate from the main game, and the main game itself uses the story as a means to justify the setting rather than to say something actually purposeful. When played in its vanilla form, it's a vapid experience that doesn't measure up to being a good story or even a good thematic message. So in essence, Best Direction normally concerns itself with the construction of the project, but our focus has more to do with how well all aspects of the game contribute to conveying that thematic intention of the creator, whether or not there's a single creator or multiples. And those intentions need to be interested in something at least partially concerned with comments on the human condition. If the concern is profit, player retention, or something similar, more than likely it's going to be noticed, and that kind of thinking actively detracts from the genuine insight that this category demands. Next up is Best Gameplay Challenge and Achievement. Awards excellence in player engagement and enjoyability. Contributing factors include accustoming the player to the controls, objectives, and expectations of the experience, dynamic or evolving obstacles, difficulty fairness and balance, and how the gameplay may instill meaning in the player through conflict and resolution. This is specific to the player's alias in-game and/or range of control. As mentioned earlier, we have two gameplay categories, which we felt was best given that games are first and foremost gameplay experiences. The first version of this is Challenge and Achievement, which is not necessarily interested in the hardest games ever, but more so games that strike a healthy balance between challenging, but are also reasonable and rewarding to play. For good examples of this, I have Halo, Dark Souls, and Slay the Spire. Even though I rank Slay the Spire as aesthetically very drab, it's hard to argue with the excellent challenge provided in this roguelike. The thing that makes Slay the Spire exceptional for this category is that it demands players build combos and decks that deliberately break the game. This makes it so the player is encouraged to experiment, improvise, and play to the absolute best of their ability because the game is so finely balanced it can handle that level of play, and in fact greatly empowers the player because their efforts are keenly acknowledged. Halo is also a good take, but understanding the magic of Halo has been a subject of long debate, so I won't waste my breath here trying to unpack it all. But what I will say is, it's a challenge that's hard to ignore once you've played it, especially on the near infamous legendary difficulty. And finally, I put Dark Souls on the list because overcoming its wide variety of challenges for the first time is a euphoria that's unmatched. As for a poor example, I have the Stanley Parable, a walking sim in which your only real choice is to decide how obedient you want to be with the narrator who comments on your actions. This game leans much more in the exploration side of things because ultimately what you're doing is just testing the limits to see what other responses you can get out of him. My other example might be something like Animal Crossing, which has challenges, but it's another case where there's no winning or losing so much as just vibing and zoning out. In other words, it's hard to fit when there's no opposition or barriers to attempt to overcome. Next up is Best Gameplay, Discovery, and Expression. Awards excellence in player engagement and enjoyability. Contributing factors include accustoming the player to the controls, objectives, and expectations of the experience, dynamic or evolving player choice and customization, and a sense of exploration or personal demonstration. This is specific to the player's alias in-game and/or range of control. So it's a similar description as challenge and achievement, but it's a bit of a different ballgame when it comes to discovery and expression. So some good examples I have of this are Super Metroid, Dark Souls, and Animal Crossing New Horizons. New Horizons provides a picturesque space in which the player is free to explore their own creativity, making this game an ideal choice for the category. Metroid is also a good example because, in addition to the vast number of secrets to discover, there are also numerous alien biomes to explore. Metroid Prime takes this a step further with its scanner where you can read up on the creatures and plant life you encounter. I also put Dark Souls in for both gameplay categories because it's a good blend of the two. While known for its difficulty, the world building in Souls games is astronomical. Background cutscenes, NPC dialogue, item descriptions, item placements in the world, these things all make for a truly engaging space that remains exciting to explore from beginning to end. It also has the benefit of being able to customize your character, not just in appearance, but also in its diverse build variety with the armor, weapons, and spells you find from exploring the world. And some poor examples of this might be something like F-Zero or Getting Over It. F-Zero is a great game, but aside from one racetrack saved for the end, you basically see all the different tracks on offer after a single Grand Prix. As for Getting Over It, you could argue that the player will want to know what happens when you really finish it, but I don't think many people would argue that the incentive to experience that ending comes from your appreciation of the world so much as it is from the frustration of feeling like you aren't allowed to access it without putting up with a bunch of bullshit first. Alright, let's move on to the last conceptual category, Best Level Design. Awards excellence in the progression and flow of the experience, including implementation of theme and variation, the segmentation of locales or stages, environmental interactions, including obstacles, scene division, and gameplay length are all considerations. Includes difficulty ascension, where applicable, and atmosphere, or vibe of the experience. An easy way to separate this from gameplay is that in a gameplay category, it's all about what you do as the player, while level design instead involves all aspects of the scenario, what the game tries to do to you. So that includes the game's length, its replayability factor, the difficulty spikes, and most importantly, the progression and flow of the opposition you face, the evolution or reinventiveness of encounters. My good examples for level design include Super Mario World, Zelda Twilight Princess, and Halo Reach. Mario's reputation precedes him, but I think the fact that we have two Mario Maker games in which players get to create their own levels suggests something about its brilliant design. And part of what enables that to happen is the sheer quantity of interactables you can find. Blocks, enemies, practically anything can be picked up and hurled around to make for all sorts of interesting interactions, and you can leverage these to create interesting flow state scenarios. While many Zelda games have noteworthy levels, Twilight Princess is arguably one of the best. The game is frequently cited as a fairly mediocre Zelda title, however, its dungeon designs are highly ranked. The in-between sections are interesting enough to bridge the gap, but the dungeons really do steal the show, with tremendous variety in challenges, a steady progression in difficulty, and great incorporation of theme into dungeon mechanics. Finally, Halo Reach for me represents one of the best shooter campaigns in terms of scenario design. Each mission is entrenched in the game's narrative, while also providing a vast multitude of experiences. For just one example, there's one mission on a beach in which you fight your way into a space dock and launch yourself into space. Then you have a dogfight and end the mission by ambushing an alien star cruiser in zero-G battles. It's deserving of the title of Mission. Not to give you whiplash, but my poor example for this would actually be Halo Combat Evolved. Even though the gameplay is fantastic, The vast majority of the game's environments repeat the same sequence of rooms over and over again. You could still argue it in the positive, but for me, the impression I get is that the game artificially overstays its welcome through this recycled content. The situation mostly gets worse as the campaign progresses, culminating in an experience with significant pacing flaws. Games that don't fit well with challenge and achievement are also less likely to be a match here, I think. The Stanley Parable, for example, has novelty, but there's not really obstacles to concern yourself with. Your surroundings don't really take you into account, unlike something such as Portal, where at least there are puzzles to solve. So that kind of sums up everything for the conceptual categories, so let's move on to the visual group. First up is Best Art Direction. Art direction involves the cohesive vision of all art assets to create a visually engaging style that complements and enhances the story and themes of the experience. With matching tone, identifiable motifs, dynamic variety, color, and texture, and proper use of scale, art direction enhances and guides the story world's overall visual aesthetic with a unique and fitting look. Some of the most overt examples I could think of for this were Earthbound, Zelda: Ocarina of Time, and Hollow Knight. Earthbound has this acid trip visuals which complement its strange premise. Ocarina of Time is an early 3D graphics game which have visuals that have aged very poorly, but it manages to capture a moody atmosphere all the same. And Hollow Knight takes the concept of bugs and somehow manages to capture a horrifically bleak narrative. Art is largely a matter of taste, but there's something to be said for art direction that can help communicate to the player the way they should feel about the game's themes and ideas. We're talking mood, tone, atmosphere, but also the scale and visual iconography. Hollow Knight again knocks this out of the park, with clearly defined enemies that manage to be creepy and unnerving despite their limited designs, so it's an achievement in that respect. For some poor examples, I have Draken and Slay the Spire once again. If you've ever played Draken on Super Nintendo, you know that it has severely contrasting visual styles that really only achieve confusion and shock for the player. Slay the Spire has this tongue-in-cheek art that sort of tries to capture your 5th graders Dungeons & Dragons group, but it's not bad enough in some places and it's not good enough in others for it to really be committed to something specific, so at least for me, it's a big miss. The other kinds of games I might stress are titles like Call of Duty or maybe Spider-Man. It's not that they have bad art direction so much as they try really hard to replicate real life, almost like a movie. We might nominate games like this, but I would be willing to guess that you shouldn't hold your breath for it. The gaming landscape is packed with visually interesting experiences, and the skills needed to create a visually interesting look are not the same as what you need with a film, which is somewhat how those games seem to want to take it. And so if I had to guess, I'd probably suspect that we'll be more interested in games that are designed visually for how the player is going to interact with those visuals, as opposed to something that just looks nice and could have been an animated movie. Next up is Best Interface. This awards menu layout, navigation, and player cues and feedback. Clear player identification of surroundings, including objects, obstacles, threats, rewards, etc., are all relevant, as is the integration of diegetic and non-diegetic visual iconography. Good interface creates a subtle yet tactile connection between player avatar and in-game character models. So this is a category I think is really important because it's not solely about menu layouts and player controls, though that's a part of it. My good examples for this are Paper Mario, Dead Space, and Fallout 4. Paper Mario has a timed battle system which requires button minigames to gain extra damage and effectiveness during battles. Dead Space has your health bar as a part of your armor, as opposed to it being some non-diegetic meter at the top of the screen. It also doesn't pause the game when you look through your inventory, which means the stress is not interrupted. So these are ways in which the games are pulling you into the experience and subtly conveying important information without disrupting the flow. Fallout is perhaps the most immediately obvious for a multitude of reasons. The game can be played in first or third person. Your Pip-Boy is an actual tool on your wrist, so looking at it shows you your arm and hands to activate its controls. You can even watch your character's fingers flick the knobs and switches. You can also push the panel further away from you so that it's more akin to how you'd be looking at it as if it were real life. And these are all just nice little details that, again, anything that's going to bridge the gap between what you're doing in the real world versus what you're doing in the game's world. To make for our unfavorable comparison, I have Brandish and Mass Effect Andromeda. Brandish is an interesting game that's severely hindered by having such a bizarre interface. It's a top-down dungeon crawler, but the problem is instead of U-turning, what you actually do is rotate the entire world 90 degrees. The environmental art is not particularly detailed, and the way in which you snap from one perspective to the next, as opposed to a smooth transition, really compiles together to make for an incredibly jarring experience. It's unique, but it's also a pain to deal with, and so it's one of those examples where, yes, you could argue it's innovative, but it's also just gone way too far with it, such that it's kind of janky and awkward, and it doesn't really get better with time. Mass Effect Andromeda has pretty awful facial animations that severely disrupt your ability to invest in emotional moments in the story, so I'd call that an interfacing problem. It also has some bullshit crafting system where you've got a huge list of different things and then there's a separate menu to navigate through them, and it's just a convoluted mess when it could be a lot simpler. Another really bad example would be pretty much any Ubisoft game, especially Assassin's Creed. The meme about how Elden Ring would have looked like if Ubisoft had made it by taking the clean layout and filling it with waypoints, objective markers, and text really speaks for itself. It's a cluttered mess, it's ugly, and all it does is show a lack of confidence in the content on offer and a lack of trust in the player to remember what they want to do. Next is Best Visual Immersion. This award involves the creation of visually engaging environments, including the illusion of free space as accomplished by environmental life, such as weather effects, artificial intelligence, animation, graphical detail, hitboxes, and software performance. Environmental interactions, physics such as explosions and weight, are also considered for contextual believability and immersion. So when we were theory crafting the categories, visual immersion was originally entitled visual engineering, and the idea there was it would be a more technical focused category. But the problem with that is you end up focusing more on technical function instead of how tech is used to create a more convincing world, which is what this is really interested in. So my examples for this are Castlevania 4, Halo Combat Evolved, and Elden Ring. Castlevania has extremely detailed backgrounds that are unique with every stage, such that it goes a long way to making up for its frame rate issues. This can be similarly said about Elden Ring, despite being in a completely different era. Elden Ring also has far less performance issues, but it is nonetheless having the same kind of emphasis on enrapturing landscapes, complete with weather and physics like enemy death animations. Now you might not immediately notice how Halo fits in, but my argument here is that when you're fighting a group of enemies, typically you'll see a handful of grunts following their elite captain. And if you kill the elite, the grunts will see this as a dangerous turning point and will flee in terror. This is a realistic reaction for them given the context of the world, so your sense of actually being in this place is not damaged because you are getting a genuine response. From a gameplay, challenge, and achievement perspective, that category would be interested in that you've created a strategic advantage by taking out the elite. But from a visual immersion point of view, it's interested in the fact that this situation can happen in the first place. As for poor examples, I would say Assassin's Creed also deserves a point here. We already discussed how cluttered the interface can get, but it's possible to argue that all the information is important and is conveyed to the player in a way that is essential, but you'd still have a hard time arguing that it doesn't break immersion because it very clearly does. Another somewhat obscure example is the bottomless box in Dark Souls. The box is clearly magic, so it makes sense why you can store as much as you want, but it doesn't make sense how your character can carry 25 claymores on their person without the box. Link having an inventory of explosives, weapons, and tools doesn't match how we know reality to function, but it's also something that has to be there in some capacity for the gameplay to work at all. No one wants to fast travel constantly to change out your equipment low, but it is one of those things in game design that can hurt your suspension of disbelief, and therein can potentially hurt your chances for landing a visual immersion knot. To be clear, Zelda and Dark Souls have a lot going for it that can overturn some of these smaller negatives. Something like Fallout, for example, does have a weight capacity system, but mostly what this accomplishes is straight up frustration because you have to fast travel, drop off a bunch of your junk, and then fast travel back. That's what you end up doing. Instead of actually managing what resources you will or won't take, you can't help but get a little greedy, and the game won't do anything to actually stop you from doing that. So it's kind of one of those things where it's a small issue, and if it becomes a big enough and important point for an Academy member, it can stop them from getting the nom, but it also just depends. And of course, just because the category is not exclusively interested in performance, excessive glitches, bugs, or other performance problems do hurt your ability to accept what's happening. So that's where this falls under. Next is our auditory group, and we're going to start things off with Best Musical Score. This awards original music composed for the experience, the incorporation of themes and variation, instrumentation and layering, the score placement, auditory ambience, and any musical progression that may guide the development of narrative ideas are all considered. Music is primarily selected for how well it emphasizes or enhances play, and less so as it stands when isolated from the experience. For my good score examples, I put Donkey Kong Country, Soul Calibur 2, and Doom 2016. Music is very much a matter of taste, but Donkey Kong Country stands out from the rest in that it incorporates ambient jungle noises as a part of the score, which greatly elevates what you're doing in-game. It also focuses on creating rhythmic percussion that matches the poignant ebb and flow of your character's actions. The game is all about getting into a rhythm, and the music helps channel this energy immensely. Soul Calibur 2, while not an underscore or an ambient score, it's one that is easily encapsulated by the word epic, and if you've not heard it, it's definitely a standout. Fighting games need to create a very specific set of emotions, and their inherent repetitive nature demands that they find innovative ways to reignite interest, and the music of Soul Calibur 2 does this exceptionally well. Doom, likewise, creates something of a horror score meets heavy metal rock band, and the blend of these ideas reinforce how you should feel about the entire tone of the game. The score also adapts and shifts in various ways depending on how the fight is going and what you're doing, so it's a highly reactive score that does not overpower, but rather empowers the player into the kind of experience it wants them to have. For poor examples, I put Lemmings and Untitled Goose Game. Now, I'm only referring to the Super Nintendo port of Lemmings because in that version of the game at least, it plays Dance of the Sugar Plum Fairies for every single level. I can't speak for other versions, but not only is this music not original and therefore ineligible, but it's grating after a very short period of time. There's no variety and there's no theme, which just sucks. I'll talk more about Goose Game and sound, but the music cuts in and out in accordance with what you're doing, or failing to do, and it makes it difficult to get attached or really hear the music when there's hardly room for it to just breathe. So it's just not implemented well. Next is Best Musical Track. This award distinguishes itself from musical score in that it is limited to a single track or melodic theme within the game. The track often is the encapsulation of a narrative idea or ideas, or derivative of excellence beyond that of the musical score. It is thus somewhat more important for this track to maintain quality outside of the experience, how it speaks of the experience, or its universal aesthetic significance. Similar sentiments concerning musical score can be said here. However, where the score is more interested in the way it elevates gameplay and overall experience, musical track identifies a single piece of music from the score and takes a deeper look at it. So there's kind of two ways to nominate for this. The first is for how well the composition is, simply as a piece of music. And this is where my good example of Submerged City from Castlevania 4 comes in. It's a mix of jazz, organ horror, and mellow chill, complete with a flute solo that just goes nuts. So it's tough to argue that it isn't a good piece of music. This can be said about a ton of Castlevania music though, including and especially Simon's theme, Bloody Tears, and Vampire Killer. And that's where being iconic can help you out. My other examples are Unforgotten from Halo 2 and Vigil from Mass Effect. If you are even vaguely familiar with games, you are probably aware of these two pieces already. Originally, I had this category entitled Musical Theme, but it arose some questions over whether or not we had to choose main themes. I think themes are an easy and appropriate choice, but ultimately, we're looking at the strength of the music on its own. Some poor examples of this would be Dungeons of Shadows from Link to the Past. This song plays way too often and really wears on your ears after a while. It's a single-minute loop that causes anxiety for 20 minutes as you investigate the dungeon, but it also isn't the kind of thing you would put on and listen to just to hear it for its own sake. A similar sentiment can be said about the battle themes in many 3D Zelda titles. With the exception of Breath of the Wild, 3D Zelda battle music is goofy and kinda dumb. I also put Caves from Elden Ring. This is by no means a bad song, and believe me, whenever you see minimalistic music receive any kind of nomination, you can thank or blame me for it. The problem is the track is so subtle and so reserved that it makes for excellent underscoring, but isn't the kind of music that's emblematic of the wide breadth of experiences the game has to offer. Even though we might make a case for something like this from time to time, you have to remember that when you're choosing a game, you can only pick from 30 available options. But since most, if not all of those games will have an original score, so you simply have a much, much bigger pool of choices to go through. And finally, we have Best Sound Atmosphere, awarded to titles with iconic or distinctive audio. It includes all ambient noise, diegetic and non-diegetic sounds, and is not necessarily subject to realism so much as how it can bring the experience to life. Award also includes the clarity and quality of sounds, as well as audio transitions, sound levels, and noise overlap. So this is the kind of audio counterpoint to visual immersion in that it does include the technical side of sound design. However, just like with visual immersion, we're more interested in the artistic or interesting things that the designers can achieve with sound. For good examples, I have Soul Calibur 2, Mass Effect, and Bloodborne. Each of these games have very distinctive audio that will stick with you long after you've played them. Of course, this includes diegetic and non-diegetic audio, and in particular, a game like Mass Effect has to capture the space opera style through all aspects, and the sound is one of the ways it merges sci-fi with perceived reality. Bloodborne, and many other Souls games for that matter, are also important choices because they often have long stretches of time where there is no music, and as such, the white noise ambience takes center stage and must be competent as a result. Untitled Goose Game has a different kind of problem in that whenever you initiate some kind of action that would disrupt the social norm of the humans around you, the music kicks in to elevate the scene. By itself, that sounds fine, but the problem is if you happen to be discovered or if you make a mistake and drop whatever you picked up or what have you, the music abruptly cuts out. If this happens repeatedly because you're trying to force a specific outcome or salvage a particular situation, then the music cuts in and out with hardly a transition, making for an irritating auditory experience. This is not really a problem with the placement of the score or the score itself, but rather how loud and when and in what way the music and sound are brought to attention, so it adds up into being a complete mess in the end. Something like Breath of the Wild does a much better job of this. Even though you can encounter enemies, which in turn changes the music, there are vast stretches of traversal in which this will not happen, and it's in those moments that the game gives the player a chance to absorb everything. My other bad example for this is D-Force on Super Nintendo. It's just a game with really bad, clunky sound design. It makes it seem as if the game's gonna break just by listening to it. So yeah, bad sound can work against you, but also the way in which the sound is incorporated. And if you haven't noticed already, it's very much a case of if one aspect of the game isn't doing very well, or does something wrong, it can really damage other elements. So with Untitled Goose Game, it's hard to say whether or not the music is bad or the sound design is bad. We know there's a problem with the sound inclusion because of the way the music cuts in and out abruptly. But because it does that, we also can't hear the music very well. And it sort of makes it repetitive, and you hear the same parts of the music over and over again. And you can't hear it in one flow motion. So it just means that you're getting it in a very erratic and displeasing way. And so it kind of starts to hinder other elements of the game. But enough about Untitled Goose Game. We're moving on to our theatrical group with Best Female Character. Awards a female character in the narrative. This includes everything from design, role, and most importantly, writing, voice work, and motion capture by an actress, if applicable. Often characters are selected upon how well they contribute to the overall story or themes, with attention to sensibility and arcs of transformation. So my good examples for the female characters are Lady Bow from Paper Mario, Commander Shepard from Mass Effect, and Senua from Hellblade. So Lady Bow is a ghost with a butler and a mischievous spirit who really makes her presence known among the competition of your other party members. Senua, I think, is obvious for anyone who's played Hellblade, but in addition to a fully motion-captured performance, her character suffers from schizophrenia, and the game itself essentially instills this suffering onto the player, making her a crucial component of the overall experience, so it's a really good choice for this category. Plenty has been said about Commander Shepard, but it's worth saying again. She's a fantastic hero to step into the shoes of, and provides a great avenue from which to experience the story. As you can see, some of these characters have actresses, voice work, and others are simply conveyed through their writing and expressive design. You could also include many fighting game characters such as Chun-Li or Mai Shiranui. You don't have to have a deep story arc to be nominated. That said, a poor choice would be Navi from Ocarina of Time. This fairy is relentlessly annoying, and there's basically nothing you can do about it. She doesn't really even have much of a personality or show any kind of emotional depth throughout the story, and is basically just an insert to help you navigate the world, so yeah, not a great choice for an award. The criteria for best male character is the same as female character, but for men. And my good examples for this are Ike from Fire Emblem, Master Chief from Halo, and Booker from Bioshock Infinite. Say what you want about Master Chief, but remember that without him, you'd be playing generic Marine Gun 4587. His stoic persona helps you embody the spirit of the narrative, kinda similar to Doomguy, so there's a good case to be made there. Booker from Bioshock is a very complicated character, but the script needs him to operate under very specific conditions or else its messages completely fall apart. And then you have Ike, who is actually not the most well-liked Fire Emblem protagonist, but he's one of the deepest. He goes from a naive but genuine youth to a confident yet measured adult by the end, and you experience that transformation with him. Ike may not be as appealing as other Fire Emblem leads, but that's because he's a more complicated character. And for the record, complicated characters are probably going to be a mainstay here at the Oscarinas. Just because a character is unlikable, it does not discredit them from being nominated in and of itself. If the storytelling of their character is worth talking about, then it's a good reason to nominate them, complications and all. In fact, I'd suggest that you're more likely to see characters with more complicated backstories, as opposed to ones that people just like, because you can talk all day about a character that you like, but a character that actually challenges you to think about things in a different way or to broaden your perspective or to really dig into your values, is a character that's probably more worth your time than one that just looks nice or has a funny face or catchphrase. A bad choice of character would be someone like Kai Lang from Mass Effect 3. This supposed assassin basically sends you hate mail and brags about his skills to you in emails just to taunt you. He has no depth, no change, nothing to make him human. He's just an asshole, and his presence in the game actively hurts the immersion like a fourth wall breach. And finally, we've made it to our last category of the bunch, with Best Narrative Composition.
Well, you've come to the right place.
Awards the narrative concept, written prose, and story execution of a title. The storyline, character portrayal, and dialogue, along with expanded depth, nuance, and richness to the setting are all considerations. Titles may be aided by cinematic presentations, thematic devices, secrets, or additional discoveries, or a sense of uniqueness that prompts return visits. Similar to characters, this includes anything that might involve the story, plot, premise, and world building. Some good examples of this are Fire Emblem Path of Radiance, Mass Effect, and Bloodborne. Fire Emblem has a huge cast of interesting characters, a well-constructed plot with twists and turns, and enough intimacy with the main cast to maintain staying power. Mass Effect, another fine example. This one also includes extensive lore, and importantly, much of the writing is voice acted, which means it needs to be written in such a way as to be authentic for the characters speaking. This doesn't make it better or worse than Fire Emblem, it's simply one of the factors that has to be considered when composing the story. And Best Narrative Composition looks at both sides of that. Bloodborne is also a standout here in that not only does it have interesting NPCs, lore text on item descriptions and the like, but it also has a deeply rich world and a fascinating layered message with that. And while much of it is obtuse, it does reward repeat playthroughs and further discussion. For my poor example, I went with Journey. Now, Journey doesn't really have any writing, spoken or otherwise. It could still be considered for its world building, but the world design is intentionally inoffensive and vague, so I think you'd have a really hard time pitching something like this. There's plenty of games with bad writing too, such as Call of Duty Black Ops 3 comes to mind. But bad writing is also the kind of thing we want to avoid. And by bad writing, I mean anything that doesn't earn its jokes or drama, writing that self-aggrandizes, writing that's repetitive or lacking subtlety. It doesn't necessarily have to be smart, but it does need to present something compelling, and it does need to treat its characters with dignity, only breaching that when there is an important message to be conveyed. So that about covers it for our categories. If you stuck around to the end, thanks for listening. I hope my examples didn't ruffle too many feathers out there. Again, I just kind of went through my library, I threw on some games, I grabbed some footage, and I put this all together just because I wanted everybody to get just a soft sense for what these categories are interested in, and what kind of are some examples that you could probably make a very easy case for, and that you'd have a good foundation to start with in terms of building your argument, but also the kind of games that would actually present a hurdle to this, something that would actually make it very difficult for you to present an argument. And, to reiterate, I tried to make it as open-ended as I could so that when you're choosing a game to nominate, it should, in theory, be a potential option for every single category. The reality is not every game is going to do this, but if it can, then it kind of suggests something about this is the kind of gameplay experience we're looking for. It's one that has great music and compelling characters, and it's fun to play, and it performs well. If your game is doing all of these good things, then it just kind of stands to reason that it's a great game and that it's probably deserving of those nominations, and then it's probably a good pick for Best Pixel, and we can kind of recommend that with more assertiveness. At the same time, you're going to have some games that scale back on a few elements, especially when we're looking at indie games, for example, and in those cases, that's still okay because then they're going to really hone in on the skills that they're good at. Indie games tend to have really interesting art direction as opposed to a lot of AAA games, in fact. And so there's going to be a bit of a balancing act there. But for now, we're still with retro games at the time of this recording. So we're launching our first season today, and I think I've said plenty. I probably said way too much. So I'm going to let you go now. And if I timed everything correctly, it means that the very first announcement for our very first category of Best Pixel 1990 will be launching at the very end of this video, so I hope you enjoy. And I'll see you again at the end of this awards season.